Gary, thank you for coming. It's really nice to have you here. This is your book in Portuguese for anyone that wants
O Jogo dos Milhões.
O Jogo dos Milhões, perfect. It says there is a confession.
Yeah.
You studied finance,
I studied economics, maths and economics. Yeah.
math and economics at the LSE.
At the LSE, yeah, and more recently I did a master's at Oxford, yeah.
And you went then to work as a financial trader. You
Yeah.
made a lot of money.
Yeah.
And then you started campaigning for or against inequalities.
Yes.
So what's the confession
to be honest,
you have to make?
so in English the title is The Trading Game.
Okay.
And it was always The Trading Game. And I don't know about in Portugal, but in England, there is a culture now of all non-fiction books have to have a subtitle.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. So then one day, like the publishers, in England it's Penguin, they called me in and they were like, so what's the subtitle? And I had no idea there was going to be a subtitle. And they were like, we want a confession.
Okay, that's why.
And I was like, I hate it. Because obviously it gives this implication of like, I'm saying sorry, I did something wrong. But the reason they did it is because I wanted to write the book like really novelistically, like as if it was a novel. But of course, it's called The Trading Game. A lot of people are going to look at it and think this is like a guide to trading. So I think with the confession, they wanted to communicate this book is actually like kind of novelistic, it's kind of emotional, it's kind of dramatic. Like it's getting made
Yeah,
into...
so it's not a guide for
it's
you to
getting
get
made
rich.
into a film in the UK, so I think they wanted to get that message across.
And
But then it was funny when The Guardian reviewed it in the UK, they were just like, he didn't say sorry even once. So I guess you can make your own judgments as to whether it's a confession or not.
But what can one find when reading this? If it's not a confession, what you have to...
It's my story basically. So I don't come from a political family. I don't come from a political background.
Yeah.
I grew up poor in East London, in a poor part of
You
East
got
London.
expelled from school.
I got expelled from school for selling drugs. I always wanted to make money, like most young people, to be honest.
Yeah.
I was good at maths. London is a massive banking centre. This Canary Wharf is like a new banking district, which was built when I was a kid, like close to my house, in the poor part of East London. I just wanted to make money. So, other than getting expelled from school, I did all the right things. I studied maths and economics at the London School of Economics. I got really good grades. I went in to get basically a trader is like the best job you can get in terms of money. And I started working in June 2008, just before the big crisis. And basically, like the book is the story of me like trying to make money. And I basically realized over the course of my, say, 5 or 6 years as a trader, the best way to make money is to bet that the economy, living standards, society will collapse forever. Will get worse and worse forever. Because I realized, and in my opinion, I still believe, that there is a crisis of growing wealth inequality. And the wealth of the rich and the super rich is growing, and the wealth of everybody else is shrinking. And if you don't stop that, then living standards will get worse. So what I wanted to do with this book was have you experience that, because I was not a political person. In many ways, I don't want to be a political person now. But I've been there doing economics at the top level, and what I saw was an economy that's going to collapse. Yeah. And then that's why I do the work I do now. And I want to just show ordinary people in the UK, here in Portugal, that story, because that politicized me, and I think that will politicize them. Like I think we're told so much by the media that what is happening now is a recession. 1 bad year, 2 bad years, 3 bad years, it's going to get better.
We are in a permanent crisis, but they always present it as different crises. So
yeah, exactly. It's for them, it's always, it's this year's crisis, this year's crisis. But, I can't speak here for Portugal, and you can give me your opinion. In the UK, and I think in most Western countries, living standards have been falling for more than 15 years now, ever since 2008. I think especially if you look generationally, what do you have compared to what your parents had? What do you have compared to what your kids will have? Things are really getting significantly worse. I think especially in the last 5 or 6 years, living standards have collapsed really, really quickly in the UK. And what I want to say, and what I am also betting on, and what I've been betting on very successfully for nearly 15 years now, is this gets worse.
Yeah.
This gets worse. And that's what I want to say in the book.
I have a question, and maybe you can help us with political debate in Portugal about inequalities.
Yeah.
There is a common way to discuss it, very simplified. It's the same way, I think, everywhere. It's about the story about the cake. And what the government here says, and the right wing will say, and the liberals, is that you have to make the cake grow before you can distribute the cake. And people more or less know why inequality is bad. But what is difficult to explain is why inequality shrinks the cake. So inequality harms the economy. Do you have a simple way to explain that? It's not only is bad for us, for our future, for health, for mental health, but it hurts the economy.
So I studied economics at London School of Economics, so I classically trained economist. And when I was working as a trader, I kind of believed this. This is what you're taught, grow the cake, grow the cake. Then I worked 2008 to 2014. And what I saw was every year, everybody said things will get better, and things didn't get better. And the reason things were supposed to get better is because zero interest rates were supposed to get people spending, they were supposed to get businesses spending, and it didn't happen. So I wanted to understand, when I was a trader, why aren't people spending money? Because that was why the economy wasn't growing, right? And I think...
Because they don't have it.
Exactly. I decided to just go and ask people. And if you ask people, they will tell you, we don't spend money because we don't have any money. But I didn't just accept that, right? If you look into the financial situation of your average family, and I'm lucky, I come from an average poor background. I know a lot of people in average situation. What I saw was my parents' generation, property owning. So my dad, he didn't go to university, he didn't have a good job, he never made a lot of money. He was able to buy property, have a family, he owns his property now, he's retired. That's what my parents' generation did. Even poorer people, most of them did that.
They had the basics.
They could afford to accumulate some wealth. And then I saw my generation, many of them will never be able to afford property. So this is your answer. What this means is that the Western middle class, the Western average family, is going from being wealth owning to non-wealth owning. Their wealth is going down to zero over time. And I realized this in 2011, which obviously you will recognize as being the year of the sovereign debt crisis. And what we saw in the sovereign debt crisis was a very similar situation for governments. Governments spending more than their income, losing their assets, going into debt. So if the middle class is losing their assets and going into debt, and the governments are losing their assets and going into debt, where is the wealth going? These assets are not disappearing. This debt is not to nobody. So if you want to know why people aren't spending money, which is why the economy is not growing, you simply need to look at what is happening to the wealth. And I think COVID is the most obvious example. From the beginning of COVID, it was super, super obvious inequality was going to increase. And people didn't recognize that means living standards will fall. This inequality doesn't come out of nowhere. We saw during COVID the biggest and fastest increase in wealth of the rich ever in Western Europe, and at the same time the biggest and fastest fall in living standards. So I'm not against growth. I'm 100% pro-growth. There is this unbelievable naivety about inequality. And to be honest, I'm not even trying to redistribute. In my opinion, I'm the person trying to stop the redistribution. Western families are losing their assets. Western governments are losing their assets. Those assets are being accumulated by the rich and the super rich. If you don't stop that, the Western middle class disappears. And Western governments disappear.
And
Western
the economy is hurt.
Disappear. And then what that means is living standard collapse. If you want to see what a country looks like, which does not have a middle class of any size, you can see it. Go to India, go to Brazil, go to Mexico. That's what it looks like. It looks like a small, wealthy elite and a vast amount of poverty.
So I have a different, perhaps more technical question, but you talked about the zero interest rate period or the negative real interest rate at some point. And in the beginning, I have to admit that I was kind of supporting the quantitative easing policy because in some way it was breaking the dogmas on central banking and then on this monetarist obsession about inflation and so on. But at some point I realized that quantitative easing was increasing inequalities and pumping liquidity into the wrong sectors. Namely, I don't think it's a coincidence, the real estate crisis and crypto assets grew a lot during this quantitative easing. What's your opinion on this? As a previous trader, what's your opinion on the effects of quantitative easing on this massive injection of liquidity
Yeah. We have a saying in England, I don't know if you have an equivalent here, when the only thing you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
We don't, but it's a really good saying.
So I study economics, and I know you study economics as well. Modern economics, the way it is taught at universities, there is a really aggressive focus on using monetary policy, interest rates, and in extreme cases, things like quantitative easing to manage the economy. And this is basically the dominant economic philosophy of our time. This is what governments do. So
no fiscal policy.
Yeah, exactly. In 2008, monetary policy, quantitative easing. In 2020, zero interest rates, monetary policy, quantitative easing. Like, this is the way that big Western economies manage crises. And what that means is no fiscal policy, no distribution. And then I don't think it's a coincidence that in both 2008 and 2020, basically the same things happen, which is this slashing interest rates, this quantitative easing, it successfully deals with this initial shock of the crisis. There's money to do things like furlough schemes, support packages. It stops the stock market from immediately collapsing. But in the long run,
sovereign bonds and so on.
Yeah, in the long run, what happens is inequality increases, the rich get richer, stock prices, house prices, all asset prices go up, and living standards fall. I think there's another phrase, which I don't know you have. If you drop a frog in boiling water, it will jump out. But if you slowly boil the water,
that one we have.
Yeah, so this monetary policy has been this like zero interest rates, quantitative easing approach to crisis has been really effective at turning sudden shocking crises, which would have looked like the Great Depression, into these long, slow, in a way well-managed crises of living
secular
standards,
stagnation, that's
which
what they
are always combined with massive increases of wealth and living standards for the rich. So I think it's, is 2008 better than the Great Depression? Probably yes. But in the long run, both lead to massive decreases in living standards. And I don't think you can deal with those falling living standards unless you start looking at the distribution more explicitly. And it's not because I want to redistribute. It's because if you don't do anything, there will be an aggressive redistribution away from ordinary families towards the super rich.
And that means, basically changing the structure of the economy, in my opinion. So the economy is producing inequalities. Unless you change how the economy functions, inequalities will continue. Mm-hmm. However, you can tax differently. Taxing the rich has been a proposal that you have been putting forward. Mm-hmm. How do you see such tax system, and what are your good arguments in favor of it?
The first thing I want to say, because I think this is often misunderstood, is when I say I want to tax the rich, I'm talking about wealthy individuals and families that have accumulated, that have hoarded huge amounts of wealth, huge amounts of assets. Because there's kind of
to punish them, their merits.
I want to stop them from owning the things that your kids need. You cannot simultaneously allow the rich to own everything and expect the middle class and the working class to own anything. It's as simple as that. If you do nothing about these super rich people who have passive income of 5 million, 50 million a year, over time they will buy more and more. They will outcompete the kids of ordinary families, and you're seeing it in front of your eyes. The results are that children from ordinary families cannot buy homes and cannot afford to have housing. So I'm not trying to punish anybody. Listen, at the end of the day, I don't consider myself to be a politician. I don't consider myself to be a moral philosopher. I am somebody who has made millions of pounds betting on the fact that living standards for the middle class will collapse. And I'm explaining how that will happen, and I'm explaining how you can stop it. If you do not tax these super wealthy families significantly more, the obvious consequence will be the loss of asset holding for ordinary families. So if you are watching this now and you are not worth, 10, 20, 30 million euros, and you want your grandkids to have homes to live in, you have to tax the rich more. It's simple. You have a choice. You have a choice. Either tax the rich more or homeless grandkids. Take your choice. And listen, I'm a millionaire. I'm a multi-millionaire. I'll be fine either way, okay? I'm here. I don't need to be here. I don't get paid to be here. I have come here because I'm fighting a campaign in England to protect the kids and grandkids of ordinary families like my family.
So one of the problems we have when you talk about taxing the rich is that everyone considers themselves to be rich even though they barely have enough to get by. So you have Uber drivers, any other worker that today doesn't see himself or herself as a worker, but as an entrepreneur or business person or capitalist. And this is based on the idea that everyone can make it. And the paradox of this is that you prove that anyone can make it, because you are the living example of someone that comes from a poor background and succeeds, even gets rich. So how do we go around this lie that in capitalism, and well, this financialized and neoliberal capitalism, everyone can make it, so you cannot tax the rich because maybe you will be rich one day?
So the first thing to say is, it's very, very difficult to make it. I can't speak for Portugal, but I come from the UK, obviously. I come from a poor family. I went to LSE, which is a very elite university, and then I worked on the trading floor, which is a very elite space.
So you're one in a million.
I was then at Oxford, and then in the media, and then in politics, and then I have never met another person from a poor background who has become rich. So as much as I proved it's possible, it's extremely unlikely. But secondly, let's look at my case, right? So I come from a poor family. I was able to get this good job. I worked hard, whatever. I made a lot of money, and I paid 50-60% tax to make, a few £1,000,000, which is a lot of money, and I don't begrudge paying that tax. At the same time, the Duke of Westminster, who is a member of the English aristocracy, inherits £10 billion, more than 1,000 times what I made, and pays nothing. This is ridiculous. This is a ridiculous tax. And I think this is the thing, when I say tax the rich, people think I'm coming after doctors and lawyers, or heaven forbid, even bankers. These guys who are worth billions of euros, they don't work. If you have 1 billion euros, you're going to make passive income 50 million euros a year, 4 million euros.
You don't have 1 billion. You can have.
These guys have no choice but to eat your assets. What can you do? Imagine you have 4 million euros a month. How much are you going to spend? I couldn't even spend 100,000 euros a month, right? For me, that would be impossible. They have no choice. I don't think rich people are evil. I'm a rich person, okay? If you do not tax them, they will own all of the assets in 20 years. It's as simple as that. Your kids cannot compete with somebody who has 4 million euros a month passive income, and they will only get richer. They will only get richer as they buy more of the assets. And the consequence of the rich buying all of the assets is ordinary kids buy none of the assets.
Yeah. So people won't have houses, which leads us to one of the biggest crises in Portugal. And when I was studying in London, I rented a flat, a room, a closet. And I was paying, I don't know, like 500 quid or 600
That's good for London.
Yeah, it was in Camden, was central London. And when I came back to Portugal, I shared a flat, and I was paying 100 euros for my room. And I was really glad that I came back, because I was tired of paying 500 pounds for a tiny room. And in a few years, 10 years, 15 years, Lisbon is as expensive as London to rent a flat or to get a house, it's impossible. And I saw your talk with Ha-Joon Chang, which is always also one of my favorite economists. And you were talking about building houses. So should we build houses to solve the problem? And we've been arguing that you can build houses, but the construction sector wants to build luxury houses, and the rich people will buy those. And so building houses won't solve the crisis. I think you call it naive, the idea that just basically building it will solve all the housing crises.
I think it's phenomenally naive. I think it's quite simplistic. I think it's quite childish. I think it's typical of modern economists. Listen, everywhere you go, everywhere in the world, people think there is a housing crisis caused by their local mayor. People think it in London, people think it in San Francisco, people think it in Tokyo, people think it in Shanghai, in Sydney, in Vancouver, in Toronto, in Rio de Janeiro, in Johannesburg, everywhere. This is obviously a global crisis. And not only that, it's not just a house price crisis. It is a crisis of all assets. Look at the gold price. Look at land price. Look at stock prices. Listen, if you give all of the money and wealth and financial power to rich people, they will use it to buy assets. That is what rich people do. And it pushes up the price of assets and it makes assets unaffordable to ordinary people. So tell me, are you going to build enough houses here in Lisbon to solve a global asset price crisis? How many houses are you going to build? But look, okay, I come from London. We've been building a long time. And I come from a poor suburb of London, which when I was young was like, medium intensity terraced housing. Now you go back to where I grew up, there's a massive block of flats blocking the sun. So you can't see the sun on the street I grew up in. There's flats everywhere. Listen, when they build houses...
Usually poor quality as well.
Because if you build houses in a situation of high inequality, where ordinary people have very little money, the houses will be low quality and cheap because that's all people can afford. Listen, if you want to see what happens when an unequal country tries to solve a housing crisis by building houses for the poor, go to Rio de Janeiro. Is that what you want? Do you want a massive favela around Lisbon? Is that what you want? If you want a favela around Lisbon, you can have it. But I don't think that is what Portuguese people want, and I don't want a favela around London. You need to deal with the inequality. If you don't get money in the pockets of ordinary people, the houses that will be built for those people will be extremely low quality, and you will just turn Lisbon into a slum. And London is turning into a slum. Come to my hometown, it is a slum now. And listen, these politicians who are saying we're going to solve the housing crisis by building houses, ask them, are you going to build a massive skyscraper blocking the sun from your house? Because it's not going to be that. It's going to be super low quality slums on the outskirts of Lisbon, on the outskirts of Porto, on the outskirts of London. And I don't want my country to become like that.
Yeah, even if, considering that they get built because we have a supply problem. So it's impossible.
And I want to be clear, I'm not against building.
Me neither. I just don't think it will solve the problem.
If you have a building-only solution, then you will create a slum. And it's happened all over the world. And it's not going to fix the problem because it's a global problem that cannot be fixed just by building a slum in Lisbon.
We face two problems. We face many problems, but two main narrative problems. Can I have some more?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Thank you. The first one is this problem of identity. So people don't consider themselves working class. And I know you are not a politician, don't want to be one, but the left wing finds itself in a position where, the liberals are always telling people that you can be rich, and we are always telling people you are poor. You are working class, man, just stop it. So which one do you prefer? And people usually prefer to think they could be rich than to realize or to accept they will be part of a working class. Second narrative that has been really difficult to fight and to push back is immigration, which is now the main political debate in Portugal and I guess in Europe, in UK as well. And because they are blaming immigrants for everything, including the housing crisis. My question is not about the housing crisis. My question is about economics. Friedman has our favorite economist, Milton Friedman, has a paper or a speech in which he says that our problem is not with immigrants, our problem is with legal immigrants, because if they are illegal, they are way cheaper. We know that the economy needs immigrants because they need people to work. But at the same time, we see all these ruling class and elites fighting immigration and building a political discourse against immigration. So do you think they are fighting against their own interests, or they just want really cheap labor based on irregular immigration and exploited immigrants?
So I can't speak specifically to the Portuguese situation because I'm not an expert on it. But in the UK, we have this quite interesting situation where we had our right-wing party, the Conservatives, in power for 14 years. And over that time, they constantly moved further towards being anti-immigration because they have another party to the right of them that is very anti-immigration. And the Conservative Party became, from a narrative perspective, extremely vocally anti-immigration. At least that's how they wanted to be perceived. And yet they did Brexit, which meant that they had complete legal control over how much immigration they had. And they chose to really significantly increase immigration. I think it's like a super interesting thing that they did. They took a narrative position of we are anti-immigration, and yet they took a policy position of massively increasing immigration. And I think it's really interesting to ask like why they did it. So obviously I have an economics YouTube channel, which is about inequality. And I'm not an expert on immigration. I never really wanted to speak about immigration. But I started to see a couple of years ago, this growing voice in the comments, the problem is not inequality, the problem is immigration. And that just grew and it grew and it grew and it grew. And I realized like, this is a problem, right? Because I realized immediately the number one narrative block on taxing the rich is people think the problem is immigration. And I realized immediately, like, if the rich realize this, we're in big trouble. Because they will recognize the number one way to prevent themselves from being taxed is to drive a narrative of hatred of immigrants. And if you think about it, if what you wanted to do was prevent yourself from being taxed by create a hatred of immigrants, the smart thing to do is to take a narrative position of being anti-immigration and to really increase immigration. That is the most effective way to make people hate immigrants. And then you see Elon Musk come in and start funding all these anti-immigrant parties, whilst also saying he wants more immigrants for his company. So I think really what you're seeing is, it works for the rich. It's actually like a very intelligent strategy for the rich to aggressively increase immigration, whilst also aggressively funding anti-immigrant rhetoric, because that is how you make people hate immigrants. And what is very clear from my work is hatred of immigrants is becoming the number one element of the debate, which is preventing the rich from being taxed. And listen, if people want lower immigration, I think they have every right to ask for that, and that's a discussion we can have. But if what we have is ordinary people who are losing their homes, fighting against taxation of the rich because they hate immigrants, then they will lose their homes. And I don't want them to do that. So listen, we can have a discussion on immigration. I'm not an expert on immigration, and I know it's being had in a lot of places.
No, I think that's the...
But if what that means is ordinary poor people start voting for politicians who are actively cutting the taxes of the people who are out-competing your kids for homes, then ordinary people will lose homes. And I worry about that. And I do think about how we combat that. And I worry about how to speak about it. The end of the day is, these right-wing parties, they're funded by billionaires, they cut the taxes of billionaires, they are not going to improve living standards. And I would encourage people in Portugal to keep...
Or stop immigration, by the way.
Well, yeah, they won't. That's the thing. They don't stop immigration. And I would encourage the people of Portugal, like I encourage the people of England, to keep an eye on the USA, because obviously now we have an anti-immigrant, far-right political party there. They will not improve living standards. If you want living standards improved, I highly suggest you do not vote for political parties which are entirely funded by billionaires.
Yeah. So you were actually trading with what?
When I was a professional, I was trading interest rates.
Ah.
So it's loans, basically. So I made my money as a professional, basically betting that interest rates would stay low for a long time after the 2008 crisis. Which seems obvious now, but actually at the time, it was constantly mispredicted. People constantly thought things will get better next year, and the economy will recover next year, and the interest rates will normalize next year. Actually, that was all the way till 2020. And in 2020, people finally said, no, interest rates will stay zero forever, which was immediately before they went up. So it was, a very long track record of misprediction.
Okay. It's obvious that interest rate could not remain as low forever. Well, they could, but it's a big distortion in the...
Yeah, I think it was COVID that really... I mean, if you have a chance, you look at my early articles or early videos about COVID, the size of the deficits in COVID were absolutely enormous. Yeah. And I think there was, for me as an inequality economist, the big question was, who ends up with that money? And I think it was so interesting that nobody asked that, because these numbers were huge. The UK government deficit since the beginning of COVID is more than £1 trillion, which is £20,000 for every adult in the country. The US number is $13 trillion. I don't know the Portuguese number, but it will be similar. It will be something like 15, 20,000 euros per
We don't have a
adult.
deficit right now.
And I'm not against deficits, but if you're going to run that size of deficit, you need to ask, like these enormous deficits, you need to ask the question, who is going to end up with that money? Yeah. And I asked that question. I think it's amazing nobody asked that. And if you go through, like you follow it through, well, the reason the deficit is running is because you've banned luxury spending. But luxury spending is the spending of the rich. So basically, you're printing money, you're using it to pay workers, they're using it to pay their rent, it's going to the rich, and the rich can't spend it. So you're just pumping a ton of money from governments through the poor to the rich. It's like the world's biggest money laundering scheme. But I just think like this is the best example of this phenomenal naivety about the importance of distribution. How can we have a situation where major Western governments give out £20,000 or euros for every single adult, and nobody even asks, how will that affect that distribution and where will that money end up? It's crazy.
Yeah, in general, because economics does not talk about distribution. Yeah. That's the job of political economy, not
I think it should be the job of economists, but yeah, most economists you don't study at university, and most mainstream economists don't even really think about it.
Yeah, so people don't think about the distributional effects of monetary policy or their fiscal policy. One of the arguments we've been having here is that because of the housing crisis, the government had to put forward financial support for financial aid for people to pay their own rent. So they are spending millions of euros, which goes directly into the pockets of
the people who own the houses,
property owners, and so on.
Especially multiple property owners.
So it's exactly what you've been describing.
Yeah.
And what's difficult to explain, and I think it goes back to the first question I was asking, is that rich people cannot spend at the pace they are accumulating wealth.
Yeah, I think this is the simple story, you know. Somebody's worth 1 billion euros. They get 40 million, 50 million euros a year, 4 million euros a month. I think, imagine you are that person. What will you do? You have 4 million euros a month.
You want to go to space because there's nothing else you can do with your money.
An ordinary person will spend 100,000 euros a month, live like the Queen, and they will use the other 3.9 million to slowly accumulate more and more assets.
Yeah, we'll invest in stocks or
stocks, property, bonds.
Estates,
Basically, they start to increase their asset share. And if we have the rich increasing their wealth at 5, 6, 7% a year, in economies which in Europe are lucky if they grow 2% a year, but if they're growing at 5% a year, the economy is growing at 2% a year, they will increase their share of the economy. And that doesn't come from nowhere. It squeezes out the government, it squeezes out the middle class. The reason that ordinary Portuguese people cannot afford homes is because they are being squeezed out by the rich. If you do not tax the rich, then ordinary people end up with nothing. This is not rocket science. I think this is the key story. This is why I do what I do, because this will get worse. And it will end up with ordinary people owning nothing and being very poor.
Do you think this process of asset inflation and we have been discussing this quite a while. So is it a bubble or is it a sustained?
It's not a bubble. It's not a bubble.
People
have been saying for like as long as I'm alive, the current level of housing is unaffordable because they're comparing it to whatever the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. Go to truly unequal countries or truly unequal times in history and look at what the average cost of a good quality home is for an average worker. You know, tell me what that is in Sao Paulo. Tell me what that is in Hong Kong. Tell me what that is in Johannesburg, Cape Town, you know, in Mexico City, like in the UK 100, 200 years ago. In very, very unequal countries, good quality housing is always completely unaffordable for ordinary workers. And we in Western Europe are going from being middle-class nations to being very unequal countries like Brazil, like India, like South Africa, like Nigeria. I mean, I think it's phenomenally naive because people are comparing now a time of high and growing inequality to the 60s, 70s, 80s, a time of phenomenally historically low inequality. If you want to know where we're going, look to the places that already have that level of inequality. Look to Brazil, look to India, look to South Africa. That is what the future of the Portuguese and the British housing markets will look like.
So if you have to bet as a trader, you will bet on real estate prices.
I am betting. I'm betting on higher house prices. I'm betting on higher gold prices. I'm betting on higher stock prices because the power and the wealth of the rich is growing. And what the rich want is to own all the assets. And it's not because they're evil. It's because when you're that rich, there's nothing else you can do except for buy all the assets. Listen, this last 70 years in Western Europe of a wealthy middle class owning property, having good living standards, it's not normal. It's not normal in history. It's not normal in the world. We are increasing inequality. The wealth is transferring from the middle class to the super rich. And that means we are going back to what we had in history, an aristocracy and poverty. And it is already happening in places like Brazil and India. That is the future of Portugal, of the UK, unless we do something to stop that wealth inequality from growing. And there's no way to stop that without significantly increasing taxes on the very rich.
Mazzucato and Mariana Mazzucato and Varoufakis have been putting forward a concept called technofeudalism.
Okay, yeah.
I'm not sure if you heard
I'm not an
about
expert on it, but I've heard about it, of course. It's the name of Varoufakis' book, isn't it?
I'm not sure I agree with the term. I do realize what they're saying, and I think it's pretty similar to the image you were giving us, which is you have super rich, which in this case are the owners of the digital infrastructure, and they charge you a rent so you can use their space.
Yeah.
Whether that space is the social networks and media, or cloud space, or anything. Do you see any point in this argument of how do you see these techno billionaires? Because you know that the rich are getting richer.
Yeah.
But when you look at the composition of the market capitalization of the largest companies in the world, a few years ago it would be oil or finance.
Yeah.
And now you look at it and is Meta, Google, and artificial intelligence. So you see a structural shift in the way the wealth is.
I mean, online is like inevitably becoming more important, but these guys are not going to be satisfied owning just the online, right? These guys will start to compete for physical space. These guys will buy the properties. They will do it either through direct purchasing or through corporations or through lending. Like they will also own the physical space. You know, I would be delighted if these guys only wanted to monopolize the digital space, because then at least people could have houses. These guys will also outcompete you for physical space. You know, it's...
They just have a lot of money to spend.
You know, it's extremely monopolized. You know, I mean, it's very similar to what we saw, you know, in the late 19th, early 20th century when we saw these super billionaires emerging in the US and they start to outcompete. I mean, this is not a new story. If you allow any small group of people to become extremely powerful, they will, and always have in history, use that power to take the rest of the power and the wealth. This is why the USA was founded on these ideas of let's make sure we have a distribution of wealth and power, because they came from a Europe which was phenomenally unequal and had enormous amounts of poverty. You know, we should have learned this lesson by now.
Yeah, that's actually the story of how the Federal Reserve was created. There was a financial crisis, and then the rich families intervened to save a few banks and to avoid the financial crisis. I'm not sure if it was a Rockefeller or these big families. And in exchange for that support, they demanded a cartel. So they wanted an industry which was forbidden by then because of the anti-monopoly rules. And the federal bank was created afterwards because they decided that no longer they wanted to be in the hands of big industrial capitalists, because that's simply too much power. Yeah,
but we see how it ended up. You know, it's very, very difficult for me to look at the current economic situation of the world and not be reminded of the 1920s, the 1930s, where we have this aggressive wealth accumulation, where we have this aggressive increase in poverty. These guys are super, super rich. And what are they going to do? If you're Elon Musk, if you're Donald Trump, what are you going to do? You're going to see the growth of voices like mine, voices like yours saying tax the rich. You're going to say we don't want to pay higher taxes. So what's the best way to avoid it? Well, the best way to avoid it is to aggressively fund a new alternative voice. People are sick of the establishment parties. They want a new voice. Well, the rich don't want my voice to win. So they need to create a new alternative voice. And that alternative voice is the problem is immigrants, the problem is foreigners. Listen, if people want lower immigration, they can have lower immigration.
It's been like this forever.
If that means you start voting for parties that cut tax of billionaires, these are the guys that are going to own the houses that your kids need. It's as simple as that. We had a politician in my country about 20 years ago say he was intensely relaxed about the rich getting richer. Well, what happens if those guys want the houses that ordinary families need? That's what they're doing. That's what they're doing. So listen, I've got nothing against rich people. I want people to get rich. I do not want ordinary families to be squeezed out. I do not want governments to have to close down the welfare state. And that's happening in my country. We're losing everything which our grandparents fought for. If you want housing, food, energy, education, healthcare, you need to protect your resources from the rich. And you're losing. Ordinary families are losing.
You study economics?
Yeah.
And I study economics. I bet we study more or less the same stupid models.
Probably,
And
I would imagine, yes.
probably you studied a few more models than I did. I teach now at the Masters in Political Economy. It's where we take the chance to teach about financialization and weird authors like Keynes and Ilferding and, I don't know, Ha-Joon Chang and these people. So if you could give an advice on undergrad programs, so economics students would avoid being trapped to unrealistic models and learn actually something useful, what would you say?
Well, I don't want to aggressively pimp out my YouTube channel, but that's what my YouTube channel is for. So people who don't know, I've got a YouTube channel, Gary's Economics. It's getting really, really popular, especially in the UK. It's an educational channel about economics. It's designed to be easy to understand, welcoming, accessible. That's what I do it for. But, you know, there are other economists as well. I like Ha-Joon Chang as well. You know, we have people like Piketty and Zuckman, some French economists who I like. They're perhaps a little bit less accessible. They're reading to ordinary people. But, you know, if you want accessibility, we've got my book now in English and in Portuguese. We've got my YouTube channel. But yeah, I would say economics is a difficult subject to study. You need to work hard. You need to do a lot of maths. Just keep your eyes open and keep asking yourself, is this really describing the world that we're living in? What has this got to say about the real problems that ordinary people are facing? It's a difficult and frustrating subject, economics, but it will only get better if good people go into it and try to change it. So I would not like to discourage people.
Perfect. I just want to add, if you read Portuguese, which you don't, but if you're studying economics in Portugal and you read Portugal, there is a manual, a textbook on political economy. I did it with a friend called Francisco Louçã, which is also an economist. So if you're interested, not you if you're interested, but if you're interested, I think it's out there for sale. And O Jogo dos Milhões é uma confissão que não é uma confissão. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
It was a pleasure.